So breaking down in your car is really inconvenient, and they do say that prevention is better than cure. So knowing why cars break down can actually help us to prevent a lot of the problems. Now, I often hear people saying something like, it's always done that, or it's been doing this weird thing for a few months and I didn't think anything of it, and now they've broken down and need some assistance and help. So it's often a matter of just being aware of those little symptoms, those little problems. We wouldn't just go to the doctor when we're on death's door. We would listen out for the symptoms that crop up and then seek medical help early on so the problems can be prevented from escalating. It's exactly the same when it comes to your car. Your car is emitting all these symptoms or problems that are usually indicative of a breakdown further down the line. So don't be that person. Be aware of what your car is telling you and take steps to prevent common causes of breakdowns. So I've looked at the most common stats from the leading UK recovery organisations, the AA and the RAC, and there's 10 distinct categories of breakdown that they attend. So we're going to look at them in reverse order. So the first one I'm going to do is the least likely that people have of all the ones they deal with. And the last one I do will be the most popular or the most common call out that they get. And you'll see that most of these can be prevented or mitigated to some extent. So the first thing we're going to discuss is locking ourselves out of the car. Your key is not working, or you've not got a key at all to get into your car. So obviously losing your key, there's not a lot you can do to prevent that other than tying it on a piece of string around your neck. But when it comes to the battery, the car is usually telling you the battery in the remote is getting low. There's a few symptoms that happen. So firstly, you might notice you have to be a lot closer to the car to unlock it. So if that's the case, it's a sign that the battery in that remote is starting to fail. So the key itself is not just a physical device. Most modern keys have some kind of emitter or transponder in that unlock the immobilizer in the car. So even if you can physically get into a car with the key, you may be unable to start the car. There's a feature on some models where they just won't lock the car. Rather than being unable to unlock the car or having a problem with the immobilizer as you're driving along, before it gets to that state, you'll just notice that the car won't lock when you press the lock button. So those symptoms indicate that the battery in the remote is starting to die. It's on its last legs. So get that battery replaced and you'll avoid the inconvenience of being unable to drive your car. So the next area we're going to look at is electrics. Now, we're not talking about the ignition system. That's a whole other raft of problem areas, and that comes much higher up in the ranking. But we're talking generally about the electrical system in the car, the ECU, the engine sensors, other little things around the car that the engine needs to determine what's going on. So if these sensors start to fail, you may well get rough running. The car may go into limp home mode, so it protects itself by restricting the power output and running in a very, very safe manner just to enable you to get home safely. So that's not necessarily the cause of a breakdown, but ignoring the symptoms, the misfires, the hesitation when you accelerate, the other little grumbles. So being familiar with your car and how it performs and how the engine responds is key here. If you notice a change, that could well indicate there is a problem forming further down the line that will need to be addressed. So another cause for breakdowns is related to the transmission. Now, transmission problems don't just appear and happen overnight. The transmission will generally deteriorate over a period of time, and most of the issues you get with the transmission are actually related to a loss of transmission fluid or transmission oil. When that level inside the gearbox gets too low, lubrication suffers as increased friction, and that exacerbates the wear and tear on all the components within the gearbox. So if you notice a whining noise from the gearbox, you're starting to find it very crunchy to get into certain gears, and the transmission is not feeling as smooth as it once was, it's probably time to just check out the transmission, particularly those fluid levels, and make sure it's changed if it needs to be, or it's topped up to the correct level. So this is something that applies to both manual and automatic transmissions, but just keeping an eye for leaks and telltale signs that the transmission fluid levels maybe have dropped or have started to seep out can save you an absolute fortune in the long run and avoid the inconvenience of having a breakdown. Another common area that people call out for assistance is problems with the starter motor. It's either not engaging correctly and it's just spinning freely without rotating the engine, it's unable to have enough power to rotate the engine, or it's just clicking, it's not really doing anything. So that can sometimes be a sign of a bad battery, but starter motors do take quite a beating over their lifespan. Now, you will typically notice the starter motor starting to play up, maybe it's taking a little longer, or you're getting some weird clicks and whirs before the engine starts. So don't just brush it off as something that's not a problem. It's indicating there is an issue there. There is a symptom forming. That noise, that new development in starting the car is really flagging up that there's a need for attention to be paid to the starter motor. So just being aware of that and getting a garage or a mechanic, or even checking it yourself, and maybe just replacing the starter motor, can avoid the inconvenience of having a breakdown altogether. So clutch problems are another common cause of call outs, and the clutch really is a critical component, particularly in the manual transmission car. The clutch disengages the gearbox and therefore the wheels from the engine, allowing you to select gear. So it is possible to drive without a clutch. That's probably a topic for another video. I've done it on a failing clutch. I just couldn't use it and managed to limp home without actually using the clutch at all. But the clutch is that critical component. You can't really start to ignore it. Now, clutches very rarely just fail completely. They generally start to slip. So as you accelerate, you'll notice the revs climbing and the engine speed not changing. And then eventually it all mates and catches up, and the acceleration you're putting eventually is transmitted to the wheels. So that's a sign that the clutch is on its way out. Also, the lower gears tend to be much heavier, much more crunchy when the clutch plate starts to wear. So as with anything, just be aware of the car's normal behaviours. And if you notice something outside that normal behaviour, that could be a sign that you need to get something addressed. If you ignore these things, they generally come back as much more expensive problems than they would have done if you just sorted it the first time you got that symptom. So putting the wrong fuel in the car, gasoline, petrol obviously, or diesel, are quite critical for the engine. If you put the wrong fuel in, you can cause an awful lot of damage. So a lot of drivers do it. They say you always do it once in your driving career. I do know a few people that watch this channel that have done it more than once. So if you've just switched from a diesel car, or you switched to a diesel car, you may well have that problem of remembering what type of fuel to use. If your family has got both fuel types, that can also make it a challenge if you fill up both cars. So one little thing that people do sometimes in that situation where they're at a higher risk of putting the wrong fuel in is just to put a little warning sticker underneath the filler cap, or maybe even to tie a coloured ribbon around the filler cap on each car. So maybe colour code it, have blue for the conventional fuels and red for the diesel fuel. So as you open it up, you've got another little reminder just to make you think before you put the nozzle in and you start filling up. If you ever do put the wrong fuel in your tank, don't start the engine. Have a word with the cashier at the fuel station. They deal with this problem every single day and they know the procedures to go through. They've usually got contact if you're not a member of a motoring organisation that can come out and deal with that. And it's usually quite an expensive problem. You have to drain the fuel tank down safely and then put more fuel in. But it's better to do that than to drive it and completely damage the engine or damage other components within the engine. So the next area we're going to look at is electrical problems, but to deal with specifically the ignition system. So the spark plugs, the high tension leads, or the leads that take the power to the spark plugs, the ignition coil that steps up the 12 volts so it can jump the gap on the spark. They're all areas that are quite critical for the combustion process to start in conventionally powered cars. So if there's a problem there, it will generally manifest itself far before you get a breakdown as misfires, poor running, poor idling, erratic engine behaviours. So if you start getting that, then diagnose the problem. If it's an electrical problem or it's a coil pack that needs replacing, just replace it. Don't mess around. On modern cars, you can generally read the error codes of the ECU, and that will give you an indicator as to where the problem is most likely to be. So overheating engines, these are quite common when you're driving in heavy traffic in the middle of summer. So if the car's not properly maintained, if the coolant mixture is incorrect, or the radiator in the car has started to degrade, the most common thing is little fins that dissipate the heat start to rust away. And you probably won't even see that unless you're specifically looking for it, because it tends to happen at the bottom edge and there's lots of plastic covering the radiator area. So just generally inspecting the cooling system, inspecting the radiator, is it in good condition? Keeping an eye on the coolant levels and the amount of antifreeze that you have mixed in with the coolant are all critical things that you can do to mitigate the risk of having an overheating car. But also keep an eye on the temperature gauge. A lot of people just push it too hard. They watch the temperature gauge climbing up, going through the safe operating temperature into the red zone, and they still keep driving until the car shuts down, and at that point they've generally got head gasket problems, head problems. The excessive heat in the engine is really not good. The metal components starting to heat up extensively will start to expand. You run the risk of cracking and other problems in various components interfacing on the engine. So before it gets to that point, pull over, allow the engine to cool down. One little tip in most cars, if it starts to overheat, put the heater on inside the car. Now the heaters generally take heat from the cooling system and dissipate that into the car. So that effectively gives you a secondary route for the heat that's in the engine to escape. It's a nightmare doing that on summer days, but it has got me out of trouble in heavy traffic in the middle of London in the heat wave when my car was overheating. Just by doing that with the windows open, I was able to just maintain a temperature that was slightly above the ideal, but certainly nowhere near the red zone where I start risk damaging the engine. Next most common area that people call out the recovery service is tyre problems. So flat tyres, punctures or burst tyres. Now in a lot of cases there's not an awful lot that you can do about these. They're just stuff that happens. But if you maintain your tyre pressures correctly, you're generally keeping the tyre in better condition. So most tyres that split or blow out have had the wrong pressure set for a period of time, which has weakened the tyre as the tyre is flexing and bending or maybe generating more heat than otherwise it would. So a lot more stress goes into the tyre just because you've not maintained the correct pressures. Also, if you're in the habit of running up curbs, that weakens the connection the tyre has with the rim itself. I've actually seen people pop the tyre off the rim against a curb. So that's not something you can fix at the roadside with the pump. You need someone to come out and reattach the tyre properly to the rim with the correct adhesive. So always check the condition of the tyres. Avoid driving at the edges of the road where all the debris and the little nails and screws tend to accumulate. And also when cutting corners, you'll notice there's often a little triangle on the road where no one really goes over, and all the debris accumulates in those areas. So that's generally where all of these spikes, nails and screws will be located. So just avoiding those rough areas on the road will go some way to preventing punctures from happening. I got caught out with my sat nav sending me up a country road with terrible potholes, and a pothole had a sharp edge. It actually took both tyres out on one side, and I wasn't driving particularly quick. There was nothing really I could do about it other than use my brain and not follow the sat nav. So what is the most common call out for these breakdown organisations? Well, it's a flat battery problems, particularly in winter. Now think about the car as an electrical system. The battery is storing the energy and you need a lot of energy to turn that engine to start it. So straight away, in winter, the battery is struggling. A cold battery is less efficient than a warm battery. So you've just started it. Now in winter, you're cold, you want heat inside the car. You probably need to demist the windows. You need to put the rear heater on as well. They're all additional drains on the battery. So batteries are generally quite happy when they're almost fully charged all of the time. When that charge starts to drop, the battery performance significantly degrades. The battery life can start to drop off dramatically just because it's always in this zone of strain or stress. So topping the battery charge up during winter is a very good idea. If you've got a little voltmeter, it's just a good idea just to keep an eye on the voltage levels of the batteries. You can check your battery with a voltmeter across the terminal, so the sort of readings you're looking for. With the engine running, you would expect that reading to be somewhere between 13.6 and 14.6 volts. With the engine off and having given the battery a little bit of time to settle, you're looking at somewhere between 12.2 and 12.8 volts. So if it's reading 12.4 volts, that would indicate you've got about 3/4 of the charge left in the battery. And if that drops to 12.1 volts, you've only got 25% charge in the battery. So at those lower levels, you're going to have trouble starting the engine, and that could be an indicator that the battery is beyond its service life and needs to be replaced. But just keeping it charged can actually mitigate a lot of problems. I've known a lot of people that have had a battery that's just been limping along. It's been quite happy, but they've hit winter. They've maybe not used the car for a week or two, and the combination of everything has just pushed that battery too far, and it's just needed replacing. So modern batteries are generally maintenance maintenance-free older batteries, you needed to top up the electrolyte levels and just make sure that the levels inside the battery were correct. Otherwise, you'd be significantly reducing the output and the storage capacity of that battery. It's a good tool to have in the arsenal you have at home of car stuff, just having a battery charger, and just periodically during winter put the battery onto charge overnight and just make sure the battery is running at full capacity, and then hopefully you won't have any of these breakdown problems that we've highlighted in this video. So now you know what to look out for. Please subscribe to the channel if you want to have more tips on how to get the best performance and reliability from your car. Boot that like button because that really does help us to get out there, and I've lined this video up for you that you should find really interesting.